Welcome to Beyond the Balance Sheet, the podcast that helps advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families understand the complexities of issues related to our mental, physical, and emotional well-being. Our co-hosts, Arden O'Connor and Diana Clark, will interview a series of guests on a range of topics, providing informative content and practical tools for professionals and families to consider. Here are your hosts, Arden and Diana.
Welcome to an episode of Beyond the Balance Sheet podcast. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Arden O'Connor, my friend and founder and CEO of O'Connor Professional Group. Her parents are joining us today, also Arden and Peter. They have navigated the behavioral health system with their youngest son, Chris, in ways that no parent should ever have to navigate. They are college graduates, graduate school graduates, educated, stay-at-home mom, committed parents, delightful people. And despite all of their education, despite all of their commitment and love, genuine love, Chris cycled through 15 different rehabilitation programs and was prescribed over 25 medications during the course of 30 different clinical professionals. After spending countless of hours doing their own research, hiring lawyers, investing more than $500,000 in Chris's care, Arden Sr. and Peter were confused, exhausted, and frustrated. Like many families, they couldn't believe the level of turmoil, tragedy that Chris's addiction caused their otherwise really harmonious, talented, and blessed family. Welcome, Arden. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the first question today to Peter. You and I have had many conversations about your family history with respect to substance use. Were you surprised that one of your children struggled with a disorder?
I was, but I shouldn't have been. By the time we realized Chris had a problem, I was 20 years in sobriety and recovery myself. Alcoholism had affected my whole family, all my siblings. I come from a large Irish Catholic family, 11 children, and probably half have had struggled with alcohol. I myself went to AA 35 years ago. And so by the time we realized Chris had a serious problem, I was 20 years into the program. I wasn't surprised. I just wanted to put it off, and I didn't want to believe it. And I think that's probably the big thing. You just don't want to believe it. We didn't ignore them when they were young. We talked about it. We had them read books like Under the Influence. We went through the numbers saying, if you're the parent of a child who's what's the probability that child's going to have the same problem you do? And it was 20, 30, 40%. So if you have 3 children, there's a high probability that one of them is going to be affected. All that being said, when it was finally put on our doorstep, I didn't want to believe it. I sort of pushed it away. And that probably lengthened the process before we got Chris any significant help. So was I surprised? Yes, I was, but I should have been.
Well, my understanding in part of Chris's story is that he did start fairly young. You probably, even if you were going to acknowledge that he might have had an issue, you probably would have thought it would have been later. Arden,
I think that,
Arden, yeah, mom. Yeah. Did you have a sense when Chris was 12, 13 that he was struggling?
I think what happened is Chris first was diagnosed with ADD. And so you knew he was a risk taker. You were worried about that. And no, I didn't think that way. We had moved to Arizona, and the rules were different than the structure that New England provided. So I can remember an incident where I found some empty liquor bottles underneath a bathroom sink. And I immediately went to his older brother and said, "What are you doing?" And was very angry. And Matthew said, "Look to your other son." And I couldn't believe it. I really, really couldn't believe it. He was young when we moved there. You had heard things that kids were drinking Gatorade and putting the bottle in their cargo pants and putting liquor in it. And I never ever thought that Chris would do that. I just didn't know. I was taken by surprise. Again, even knowing the genetic component.
Even knowing that he was the same kid who would take an ice cream sandwich and shove it down his pants to avoid being seen by you.
I guess, you were naive. It's, you just thought of Chris as this funny bone, the guy that would take every risk and who would do silly things and push every boundary to its limits. But it was so out of the thought in our mind process at that age that no, I didn't think that way. I started to after Matt said that, but I still almost refused to believe that that would be even a thought that early on.
I completely understand that. And I will bet every parent out there listening would say at 12, 13, no,
Yes,
I wasn't
yes.
paying attention to that. That's young. And what we know is that kids who actually do start that young have an increased odds of having a problem later. So tell me when the two of you, I'm going to start with Arden and then I'm going to look at you, Peter. When was the first time you really went, how did we get here? Do you remember?
Yes, there's so many of those moments, really so many. The first time that was very early on was when we got a call from one of the parents in Chris's high school. And Chris, I believe, was in 9th grade then. And they called us and we sat down in their house and they had their sons there also. And one of the mothers looked at us and said, your son brought poison into our home. He brought cocaine. I could have fallen off the chair. If you thought that maybe, he was drinking or experimenting, that was one thing. But cocaine, not on your life. And so when that happened, I remember looking at Peter and thinking, I can't believe it. I can't believe that this would even happen to us. And so I remember looking at him, and one of the parents were reading from passages from a Bible, and I was thinking, how did this happen? How did it happen? As you said, we took family vacations together. We ate dinner together. In fact, Chris came home one day and said, he was embarrassed in school, and I said, why? And he said, because the teacher asked how many of the students ate dinner with their parents. And he said, I was the only one who raised my hand, and I was so embarrassed. And I remember saying to him, what are you embarrassed for? I said, that's really what a family's about. So we thought we had this all handled. We all were lots of joy, very fun-loving kind of family by nature. And we were all close. So yes, I took these moments, but there were so many other moments later along the line that were so much more difficult. That another incident that comes to mind is being in. Chris got told that he had to go to a rehab that was. The court looked kindly upon when he got into some difficulties in California and had to go to court and wound up in jail. And so he was put in that place. And we went there, and there was a chain link fence, and there were chains all around the lock, and there was somebody with a walkie-talkie when we came to visit him. And the two of us looked at each other and said, do you believe that we're here? Do you believe that this has really happened? So yes, it happened over and over and over. I could spend the whole broadcast talking about all those times.
Okay. Peter, what's your big memory of how did we get here?
Well, it's timing-wise, it's pretty much the same two incidents. I think the one that really got me the most was standing in line outside the Orange County Jail, waiting to see Chris. He had been in there 2 or 3 different times, and you're sitting there or standing there with 30 other people saying, what the hell am I doing here? I mean, this is not something you ever conceived in your life. that you'd be visiting a relative, let alone your son, who's incarcerated, talking through a phone, through a plexiglass window, saying, where do you go from here? And in a very peculiar sense, what happened, you got so nervous about his life and that he was going to OD on the streets someplace, that when he was in jail, at least you knew he wasn't going to die from drugs. There were a lot of other problems, but you knew one thing was not going to kill him. He wasn't going to OD from taking heroin or whatever and pass out on the street. So in a perverse sense, it was the worst time. But at some time, by the time you've been there 2 or 3 times, you took some sort of solace in it, saying, at least I know where he is. A lot of this time in the first couple of years, you had know where he was for 2 or 3, 4 days at a time. He would go underground. He wouldn't return phone calls, and you had no idea whether he was dead or alive. And then all of a sudden he'd show up someplace in a hospital or someplace, and the process would start all over again.
That is really powerful to hear, that you can almost sleep better when you know that somebody might be incarcerated, right? The sleeping gets better. Exactly. It's the upside. So our listeners, by and large, are advisors and family members of people who have resources. How were the fact that you could pay privately for treatment and lawyers and professionals helpful for Chris, and in what ways do you think it wasn't helpful?
It was a mixed blessing. In the one sense, I think we kept him alive by being able to get him into different facilities, being able to pay for different facilities. I think you extended his life. There's no doubt in my mind he would have died at 20 or 21 rather than when he did. I think you kept him out of prison. Yes, he went to jail 2 or 3 times, but by affording a lawyer, the lawyer got his record expunged and he was able to go back to graduate school. So that's the pluses. The problem you have when you're in business, you think you could just throw money at something and somebody else is going to fix your problem. And what you find out in the system, at least we found out, is that's not really the case. Is we educated ourselves over the 15 years that Chris was going through this, but he would go from one facility to the next facility, and the person who was guiding us along the line was either a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a lawyer or somebody. Candidly, I think the training in this field has been so lax that 80% of the advice we got wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. And I'm not blaming them, I'm blaming us also, because I was reacting pretty much in a panic mode, sort of running around like a chicken with his head cut off, trying to throw money, buy him a car, maybe that works, get him a new apartment, maybe that works. Or maybe, the first rehab he went to was out in Arizona, and literally the big complaint was that there was no water in the swimming pool. Now, after having done this for 10 or 15 years, you feel that the cost of the rehab program had nothing to do with how good it was. And some of the best ones were just heavily, at least in my opinion, heavily AA-based and bare bones type of operations. But the money helped in one sense. I think you prolonged his life and you gave him a shot to try and turn his life around. On the other hand, it sort of gives you this idea, if I just put the money there, even though we were involved, maybe we could have been more involved than we were, and maybe withdrawing back before we did might have been better. It's all second guessing because we did what we did at the time. There wasn't an awful lot of help to be had, and obviously it didn't turn out too well.
Arden, tell this audience about advice you received along the way that was helpful and advice that you received along the way that you wish you had followed.
So one of the first place that Chris went to was on the West Coast, and he went through their program. And after it, they had a counselor that was Chris's that spoke with you about transition into the community and what would happen. All of this was new to us, the transition, the sober home, what does that mean? All of it. Christopher, we at that point brought another person in and asked this education consultant about what to do. And he was very adamant about the ropes program, the outdoor wilderness kind of a program for Chris. And Chris got so angry, he stormed out of the meeting. And we were sitting there. Again, this was the first meeting as that type that we've ever been to. And the counselor said, "You're shooting yourself in the foot." And he was really angry with Chris. We talked with him when Chris walked out and said, "Let him calm down." And we sat there and he said, "You know, your son basically ultimately needs to live in a community that's a sober community. It isn't one of these, he will go through a program and go back to college like you're thinking and have live happily ever after. He will probably, the best thing for Chris would be to move into a small suburban community, get the support of a sober group, and maybe go to community college and finish school that way." At the time, of course, you know, Chris then came back in and heard that, and he was opposed to it. At the time, because it was the first time we ever thought of that, we were still in that mode of, he will get well, we will finish this program, and maybe he has to do some things with some stipulations after he gets out, but he'll finish school and go back to a normal life. In reality, as the years went on, Chris did that in the Berkshires. He wound up in a community that was a sober community, and it worked well for him. So I wish that was the case. I can't label it as advice that we didn't take, because Chris was so oppositional. We could never have convinced him of it, but we didn't explore it enough and really push for it either, because in our hearts, we're thinking 4 years, live 4 years or 6 years in some community that we don't know. We thought that they were being extreme, which is what we thought a lot with a lot of the suggestions in the beginning. It was only later that we said, oh, maybe that made sense. At the same time, when Christopher when we first realized that something had to be done, I called a consultant, and I never saw him. I just spoke with him on the phone. And his advice at that time was hand him his hat and kick him out the door. And I remember thinking, this guy's crazy. And I just said thank you and hung up the phone. And that never changed throughout the years, for better or worse. It is one of the bits of advice that at times probably would have been a good thing to do. But as parents, and even looking back at it now, it wasn't in our repertoire. It was not something that Peter and I could do. Could actually tell him to leave and don't come back. We had no control over so many things, but the one thing we had control of is that we could keep coming back as parents. We could keep accepting him. We could keep trying. And I always talked about everything about the ifs, labeling everything. If we did this, if he could be outside at some of these rehabs, if he went to a gym, if we had the best doctor, if the place had sunshine, it could be. And I don't know, even looking back, if we would have changed that, because that's what we are. Peter and I are, you have a problem throughout many problems, nothing to do with Chris even, is you fix it. You work on it and you fix it and you move on. You don't wallow in it. You just keep fixing it no matter what it is. And I don't know that would have changed at the time. A lot of other things changed, but I don't think that kind of procedure would have changed.
That makes sense. I do want to say to this audience that I have known many families who have struggled with substance use disorders and many committed parents, but you guys rank supreme. Your notebooks of case management, Arden Sr., are legendary. Peter, your willingness to continue to try and learn and grow and stay sober and model a healthy man were phenomenal. So I just wanted you guys to know that my vision of working with it and knowing the two of you was that what you did was show love in a way that was helpful. Yeah. So And now I want to ask Arden. I'm not going to call her little Arden, because if any of you have seen her live, she's about 1,000,000 feet tall. But it is Arden. So you were a force with Chris in the family, in the world. What was it like for you to encounter the professionals who were treating Chris? What were your thoughts about them?
So I think because of the age difference, because I was 7 years older than Chris, I often was more like a third parent than, a peer to him. And so any of the behaviors he did, I was not somebody who was going to cover it up and not tell mom and dad. I was somebody who was going to say, this isn't good and we need to get you help. I think along the way, what I felt like is we were getting advice from so many different sources and none of it was validated information. So I vividly remember a treatment center that my brother Chris was in, and I went to see the psychologist he was working with. And I said to him, I'm his sister. I want to do whatever I can to support his recovery. I love him and I want to be here for him, but I don't want to just co-sign on a plan that he comes up with that isn't helpful. What are your recommendations? And the psychologist looked at me and said, you should convince him to see me 3 or 4 days a week for the next 5 years. And, the gentleman was billing, I think, at $300 or $400 an hour. And even as a non-professional, I remember thinking, well, that seems rather self-serving. So you would have people like that. And then you'd have people who said, I remember another incident when Chris was in Los Encinas Hospital in California. And one psychiatrist told my parents, he is definitely got one of the worst cases of bipolar I'd ever seen, and put him on a very high dose of lithium. Within a week, a different psychiatrist said he would stake his career on the fact that Chris didn't have bipolar disorder. And so, for me as a layperson and knowing my parents, none of us are medical professionals. All of us are trying to do what we think is the right thing. And I just remember saying, this is very confusing. This is, there's no clear path here. And how do we even evaluate all these different voices when we ourselves have our own baggage that we bring to this situation, emotional needs and wants for Chris, an agenda for what Chris is going to achieve. So I just remember thinking it was sort of a mess, for lack of a better word, and there was no clear path. And, you're trying to make decisions as family members in a very crisis-driven situation. I always say, if people get a medical diagnosis, even if it's a really dire one, you have medical professionals who aren't necessarily incented one way or the other, who can give you, or are allegedly not incented. I suppose there are some, but in general, you can get a first or second opinion and there's clear paths of care. With Chris, it was sort of like throwing spaghetti at a wall and hoping that something stuck. And that especially when there's large amount of money and you're in the middle of an emotional crisis, it doesn't feel good as a family member. And that was frankly a big motivation to start O'Connor Professional Group.
I love that. So how has you have said what the impetus was. How was Chris's journey really influencing not just the start, but the evolution of OPG? How did that change things?
Well, I always thank Chris because he was so smart and manipulative, and his story is, I would say on the more extreme end of addiction stories, although he's by far not the worst that we've seen at O'Connor Professional Group in terms of acuity. But he was very savvy. And so I think one benefit from my perspective is I'm not a clinical professional. I own that to the families that I work with. But when I hear an incoming situation or a potential referral, I have a sense of what my brother would have done, which was usually something quite manipulative. And as sad as that is to witness as a sibling, it prepared me well for, when a spouse comes in and says, my husband went to treatment, and I say, let me guess, he's saying he's not as bad as everybody there. He should never have agreed to this. Nobody has a job. And somebody will say, well, how do you know all that? And I say, because, I've lived this before. Not only just as sort of a hands-off sibling, but I have taken my brother to detox several times. I've intervened when he was, in a drug dealer's home. Like, I've had these very acute situations, ones where I stood here and said, how did we get here? Which prepares me for the level of manipulation. I think it also prepares me for a level of empathy that we've talked about in previous podcasts. I think in many ways, I can appreciate when a family's very angry, and I can appreciate what I went through when my brother stole jewelry from me. But I can also say that I loved Chris partially because who he was under the influence wasn't who he was as a human. And it took me a long time and through help from people like you, Diana, to get there. But I could separate the two, and that made me capable of coming back to the table each and every relapse and not saying, here's your hat and take off, buddy. And it helps me when I'm talking to a family member. I think of a referral that came in last week where somebody said, I think my son lacks discipline and he needs to just figure this out, or he's got to get out. Or I think of another referral where somebody said, I don't want to put him in a nice rehab because he doesn't deserve it. He's really, this was a gentleman with psychiatric issues, and he said, I feel like he's been in those. We need to put him in a place where he really has to earn his keep. And I remember saying, in a gentle way, it's your money, it's your prerogative, but here's my view. And that was largely based on my experiences with Chris. It's not supposed to be a punishment. Treatment is supposed to be something that helps someone get better. And that, if I hadn't had those experiences, I think, frankly, I probably would have had a more judgmental attitude about people who make bad choice after bad choice.
So, in one word, what is the characteristic of your family that helped you survive, grow, manage the many years of Chris's struggle? What's that word? What is the characteristic of the O'Connor family?
So your word would be love, which would not be our word because it's a little too it's a little too fluffy. As
squishy.
You know. We're Irish Catholic. We don't talk about that. I would say forgiving. I mean, I think the piece that you already mentioned, but the piece that keeps me in awe, and I'm very much appreciative of my parents coming and talking about this today because it isn't an easy topic. He died 3 years ago, and it's still even more raw in some ways now than it was when it first happened, when you're in shock and you're dealing with all the logistics of a funeral and getting, condolences. But my parents have, both with Chris and with my brother Matt and I, there's just unconditional support and an immense amount of forgiveness. And I always say that, sometimes people ask me about an intervention. Well, how successful can this be? And can you guarantee, that's my favorite question, can you guarantee this is going to work? We can't guarantee anything when it comes to behavioral health. That is the honest truth. We can't control a loved one's behaviors. We can do things that maximize the chances that they might accept help, but we can't control the outcome. And part of, I think, accepting a loved one with a diagnosis is also knowing that some of what you're doing is to know that as a family, if the worst happened, which it did in our case, and in my case, that you tried everything. And, Chris passed away, and I still take a lot of pride and a lot of solace in the fact that even when we thought something was bad, even the last 2 days before he passed away and we suspected something was awry, all he heard was, we will support you getting help. If you had a relapse, we'll bring you back into treatment. And I feel like that. So I answered a very quick question with a very long-winded answer, but I would say forgiveness, unconditional forgiveness is the best way to describe our family. And it's 2 words, not 1.
All right. I like that. Arden, Peter, do you have a different word?
Humor.
Humor.
Lots of humor. A ton of humor.
That's what I would have said. You guys have a resilient sense of humor that is awe-inspiring.
Thank you. That's served us well. And in the worst of times, we've found an opportunity to have a moment to be able to laugh at something. And as Arden said, it's very raw, Chris's death still. And even there, you have a moment. I told Arden that I took her new dog, which reminds us of Christopher so much because he's just wild and runs all over the place, has limitless energy, and doesn't listen to you. And I took him to Chris's grave because I was watching him, and he immediately defecated. And I said, Chris is laughing right now, right on Chris's grave. This is so for Chris. So I honestly, even in those moments, that's what served us well.
Exactly. Thank you. Peter.
I would probably say perseverance. We just stayed with it.
Yes.
There were a lot of treatments. I don't know how many probably 20 or 30 doctors, or other psychiatrists or psychologists, but we just hung in there, even as Arden said, right until the end. The last 2 days were terrible because she knew he was relapsing, and we still were willing to give him another chance. But part of the problem, going back to what you said, what did all this mean for you? We got to see the real Chris for the last 4 years of his life. The 15 years we chased him around the West Coast weren't the same years as the 4 years he was back in Boston. He was sober. He was seeing the people out in Great Barrington who had a close affiliation with. He was going back to school. And I think in my case, I probably underestimated the degree his addiction was. I knew what I did when I got sober. I know how long it took. I watched my other son, Matt, do the same thing. And I couldn't understand why Chris kept relapsing. And now you can tell me better than I know. There's different degrees of addiction. And I think on a scale of 1 to 10, if I was a 3, he was a 9.5. And he just had this itch that he had to scratch. And unfortunately, after 4.5 years, he scratched it, and fentanyl was in the neighborhood, and that was the end of it. But we stuck with him. And you have to understand, this was a wonderful kid. I mean, I learned as much from him as from any individual I've ever seen. He never took advantage of people. All the damage he did was to himself. He was just a nice human being. And I think we had this idea that we made it, that after 4.5 years, he was going to graduate. He was going to be a member of society. And it wasn't just his death. It was the surprise of his death all over again. And I think is still the most difficult to understand of all of this.
That makes sense. So we've got unconditional forgiveness, humor, and perseverance. It's quite a recipe, and quite a family. Thank you, the O'Connors, and thank you, listeners, for coming to the episode of Beyond the Balance Sheet podcast. If you like us on your platform, we would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Balance Sheet, a podcast designed to help advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families solve some of their biggest medical, psychiatric, and emotional challenges. Visit beyondthebalancesheet.com to read more about our guests and resources, and sign up for our newsletter.